Sustainable entrepreneurship is a rather broad term. Sustainability is very broad. The perceptions on sustainability are very different. What is meant by that? It has an economic business aspect, it has a social societal aspect, it has an environmental aspect. So it's a rather broad term, and the same counts for entrepreneurship. When we consider TU Berlin and we consider our entrepreneurs, we speak about teams starting a high-tech startup with a couple of people working together with a public limited legal structure. If I go just a few hundred meters to the next university, the University of Arts, entrepreneurship sounds very different. Entrepreneurship means self-employment of people working as actors, as artists, as sculptors, and that's very different what entrepreneurship actually covers. It goes really from self-employment, from partly self-employment to full self-employment to startups with a very simple business model, doing something, serving food, transporting something, to high-tech startups that are really complex, that handle really complex technology. So we have two terms that are extremely fuzzy, big, broad, and hard to define. And we bring them together and it gets even more complicated. Why do we actually not have so many startups, if it makes sense to have them, so many entrepreneurship, self-employed, whatever, that is sustainable, that supports somehow social, societal, environmental goals and makes sustainable transition possible. And that's something I want to explain along a dilemma situation, because we are in a kind of social dilemma. If you look in science, science describes different dilemma situations. Good dilemma situation or a good and very non-good dilemma situation we are currently in. If you take this Ukraine war, we are in a kind of what science called chicken game. There are two sides that rush towards each other with a high speed, and it might explode. And in the worst case, we might have a nuclear war. We might have nuclear bombs dropping somewhere. Nobody wants that. I even believe none of the sides wants that. But at the moment, both sides are rushing towards each other. So that's the worst outcome in this game, and both sides know that's the worst outcome. But no sides want to lose, but losing has a lower, much lower payoff, a minus payoff than winning, and winning would mean the other stops and someone wins. And that's the chicken game, and we have that chicken game often in policy, and we had that chicken game often in history. And that's the dilemma situation which looks for a solution. And dilemma situations are modeled normally with game theory, and you can actually put a graphic and you fill in the numbers from the worst outcome to the best outcome. Another dilemma situation would maybe, it's a good example, the volunteers dilemma. Just imagine you leave TU Berlin and there's an accident on the street, and there is someone heavily injured. And a lot of people around, as the situation quite often occurs. Everyone will be better off if someone helps the injured person. You feel better, even if you don't do that, you feel better, everyone feels better when this person is helped. However, helping itself is costly. So actually, everyone has a better payoff if someone is helping, but the one who is helping has to pay a price for that. And that's also a social dilemma situation which occurs very often. Nobody helps in the situation. And to describe the situation, why actually there is not really an incentive to behave sustainable or to go into a sustainable transition as startup, I would like to use the prisoner's dilemma. It's sometimes misleading, the prisoner's dilemma, because two guys, that's the story behind it, two guys commit a crime. But the crime isn't the story here, because the crime is not bad in the story. The crime is okay. The story is about cooperating or non-cooperating. And the guys can cooperate by staying silent when they are at the police. And both have a quite good payoff when they are there. They have a worse payoff if they confess that they commit a crime. If only one confesses, this guy has a highest payoff. So defecting, non-cooperating, if you see the individual strategies, is always the dominant strategy. I also have it here as a link. I hope I can do that. Okay, that's to show you in a small feature how this dilemma situation actually evolves and what it means. It's really true. I mean, from a rational point of view, it does not make much sense behaving sustainable because you have to lose a lot doing so. Also a startup. For the entire community as collective good, it makes a lot of sense because it avoids temperature rise, it avoids climate destruction, it avoids many things in the future that will come if we don't change and if we go to a sustainable transition. The problem often is that actually behaving sustainable or having a sustainable business model means to give something to a collective good, to a community, to see, let's say, the global world as a community, as a social community of ourselves. And that's always a difficult thing, to create collective goods from an individual perspective. And that was this dilemma situation actually model. From your own individual perspective, it might not make sense actually contributing to a collective good. And that makes it so extremely difficult to actually get a sustainable transition done. It goes from you as individual to smaller units as startups, as companies, as enterprises, up to entire countries that have their economy, to economic, let's say, regions like the European Union or Northern America, all have their own strategies, their own egoistic beliefs and their own egoistic behaviors. Coming then on a top level to a collective good is extremely difficult. Still, there are some incentives. I mean, even from a business point of view, we might profit from a sustainable transition and from sustainable startups. If our climate, in our natural environment, in our living quality by having a social environment which is much nicer than we have it now, would make some businesses better in tourism, in leisure time businesses. Maybe even some products would sell much better than now if we have that. So companies might profit also from a sustainable transition. Not many and not all, and probably we will not have a growth having a sustainable transition in contrast. But still, companies might profit from that, and we all might profit from it from a living quality. And that's also the more intrinsic thing people have in mind. When we all probably agree somehow, it would be better when we would do. And probably 99% of all societies, of all people in all societies, would agree to that of course we should protect environmental changes, we should stop climate change, we should make sure that 1.5 temperature rise is the maximum, we should go for that. To that point we probably all agree. To the behavioral point, which would result out of it, we are not agreeing. The question is, but how can we come to that point? We have an existing economic structure, we have an existing thousands of enterprises that do business in countries, in developed countries, probably many more than in underdeveloped countries. We have governments that can set rules, that can enact legal structures, can set incentives for behavior, and we have startups. And to my belief, and therefore sustainable entrepreneurship, startups are a major driver when we go to sustainable entrepreneurship, because startups can start with sustainable business models. They can build in a sustainable footprint in their doing. Existing companies have a footprint that is not based, mostly not based on sustainable thinking. Most business models are based on efficiency, on the exploitation of resources, on the exploitation of labor. It's fine. I mean, 50 years ago, we didn't think about it. We thought about business, and business was focused on business was central. So many business models that are still existent are not sustainable because nobody thought about it when the companies were starting out. But now we have a chance actually to build it in. And therefore, startups with their employees and with their business models, from a logical point of view, have to be a major driver. And we also have come so far that we defined what we actually mean with sustainability, somehow defined in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not that old. I mean, that's now 7 years old when it was formulated at the United Nations. But we at least have formulated 70 goals that we see as framework for economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And it's now very rough here with us 17 squares. But of course, there's a lot of text and definition behind it. Still is fuzzy, it overlaps, and sometimes that isn't really consistent. But at least we have a measure, we have some frame to work on. And that frame can be inbuilt into business models. Now, business models is a difficult thing. I mean, the first you might encounter at the university is a business model canvas from Osterwalder. It's very simple, maybe an oversimplified business model with 9 assets you have to fill in and to define your own business model as startup. There are many more of this business models that guide you to develop your own business model. I have written down a number of sources here where you can find that, but I think for the first thing you should keep in mind, a business model can be constructed in a sustainable way and can be itself, from a business point of view, also be sustainable when you do that. But you have to construct it right from the beginning like that, otherwise doing it in hindsight becomes difficult. By the way, here at the Center for Entrepreneurship, we do that. We do measure every startup we incubate 3 times, in the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and we see the path towards sustainable outcomes. So we cover the sustainability of startups that come out here at TU Berlin, and we are only incubating sustainable enterprises. What is a matter of definition, because sustainability is fuzzy, but we are, let's say, in Europe, one of the only centers that all go strictly towards sustainability. I can tell more about it, but it's not part of this lecture here. That's our incubation place here. Maybe some of you have seen that. It's not far from here. Eins, it's a big co-working space. Let's come back to sustainability. As shown, it has 3 facets. It has the economic side, it has the social or societal side, it has the environmental side, and that interrelates somehow. You also could say the environmental side is also somehow social. It has a kind of social entrepreneurship that's very heavy, and it has a kind of profit entrepreneurship, or at least entrepreneurship in a way that you have revenues from what you are doing. Otherwise, your enterprise wouldn't be sustainable. What we have done is to get a better grip on that. We ask all the members of the CENT network. CENT is an organization where all members engaged in social entrepreneurship are organized in Germany. It's a quite big organization. And we ask them, what do you actually mean when we speak about social entrepreneurship? And here you see some results and how important that is for them. So the most important thing is a positive influence on society. So it's actually more a political task of social entrepreneurship by influencing society in a positive way. And you see that there are many facets coming back there. It's a societal side, it's a political side, it's an environmental side, it's a business side, the economical side. And in the next step, we were intercorrelating that all and looking what actually belongs together. And there, the first surprise was, yes, the societal and social side and the economic side are quite strongly addressed by them, but the environmental side is a bit different. So you see that this correlation between the summarized opinions about these members of SENT. So there seems to be a difference in a society between defining sustainability in a way that it rather addresses environmental issues or it rather addresses societal or social issues. And that's the fact. I'm not interpreting that, but it's the fact that there is somehow a distinction in our perception, that some people, when they speak about sustainability, more see the environmental side and other people somehow see more the social, societal side. And that goes back in history, and that's also different between countries. You have countries with governmental social systems as France and Germany that developed over 100 years ago. And you have countries where the social systems are privately organized, and in these countries with a private organization of social help, social support, they see more the social side of sustainability. The countries with social security as a governmental task, with social insurances for unemployment, for health, for a pension, see it more as an environmental task. So you have differences. So when we speak about sustainable entrepreneurship, we might mean two different things when I'm speaking to someone from the United States or someone from France. So we have to keep that in mind when we deal with this term. Also, when we look at the economic status of our economies, that's usage of electricity in different regions. In Europe it's pretty high. US is ridiculous, by the way. But when I look at Africa or something, they hardly use energy. So what does it mean? We produce a lot of energy and release a lot of CO2 for producing energy, for having those living standards. So when we speak about sustainability, we might talk about replacing our energy production, not even reducing it, no, replacing it. When someone in Africa speaks about energy, where most people don't have any electricity, it is another story. First, electrifying all the countryside there would be a step ahead. For us, it would sound incredibly unsustainable because you need much more power stations first built there that say increase their energy consumption. So there you see some contradiction. I mean, we cannot ask them keeping as low as they are in their electricity usage, but we don't want to go down. Actually, we are going up in the next years by using more electricity to replace even dirtier energy sources. So in this way, you see the contradiction when we speak about entrepreneurship and sustainable entrepreneurship. It might look very, very different in poorer countries, in developing countries than here. If you look here, it's the same thing. Where is the CO2 released? It's at our place, or actually we are not the deep red areas there, but we are not doing good anyway. So there are real differences. In Africa, the people, or South America, at this picture, the people don't have any problem with CO2 release. Why should they even speak about reductions of CO2 release? We have a problem with that. It's the northern sphere of the globe has a problem, and Australia has a problem with that. Also, speaking about it, it's the release is one side of it. The release is one side of it. The other is how we actually prevent nature from capturing carbon. And when we take one car, and the car needs 80 square meters for driving and parking, we already take away 80 square meters before a car has even an engine. And it doesn't matter then if the engine is electric or a classical petrol-driven engine. The green side is getting less, and with that a car is actually negative for the carbon circulation. And you can call many of the things we do as replacement to keep up our living standards, which are actually just going from a red side to reducing the green side instead of really reducing carbon. Also, when we look at the overshot of resources, actually in May, if I'm right, the resources that are there for our country to use are used. So we are through for the resources we have actually for our provision. We are used in May, as most industrialized developed countries. There are only a few countries that actually are in the, like Indonesia and Ecuador, that are somehow use the resources properly distributed over a whole year. So when these countries now meet every 2, 3, 4 years to a climate summit, it's interesting to talk. I mean, what's our argument saying to the countries that actually use resources in a much better and distributed way than we do? You have to save resources. So sustainability can have very different angles to look on. And that you should keep in mind. Sustainable entrepreneurship isn't the same. It always depends on the perspective. Do you see more the social or environmental side, or do you see all three sides, economic, social, and environmental? From which point you see it? From a highly developed, wealthy society which overuses resources, or from a very poor society which actually has a scarcity on resource use? And next thing in sustainable entrepreneurship, which will be important in the future, is being authentic. At the moment we are at an age where you see that actually there is a societal pressure to behave sustainable as startup, also as enterprise, even as human being on a street. But as startup, it's very important nowadays to be authentic in a way that you are really sustainable. Because it's nice doing greenwashing, greening, but that all will collapse in a couple of years, when you ask me. It's too obvious when you greenwash, because when the situation gets more and more dramatic, when the CO2 levels in the atmosphere go up and cannot be stopped, all the, let's say, stories and narratives we hear now on being sustainable, being green, and going in a sustainable transition, and if I hear all the pledges that are, we will be carbon free in 2040 or 50 or 30, it's fine. It would be nice when they do, but we all know probably not. And for startups nowadays, when you start now, it will be extremely important to stay authentic in a way that people believe you, that you really do what you do, that you're really sustainable, and that you can make it transparent to the outside. That will bring you market advantages. People will buy your products. You will get partners. You will be financed, and you find the right people working for you. And finding the right people working for you is already a huge problem for startups here at our university, but for startups in Berlin in general. It creates somehow trust. It creates reliability. So authenticity, as it is labeled, gets one issue of companies which will be really important as sustainable entrepreneurial startup in the future. In the literature, you find also that scientists love that to find types or examples, prototypes of people that can be defined as being green. In the literature, you find categorizations of visionary champions, ethical mavericks, that are more value-driven people, innovative optimists, green entrepreneurs that are profit-driven. So being green can have, as I have shown in the beginning, very different motives. You can really recognize, okay, it's a new business opportunity, let's go for that. Can be a motive being green. It's maybe not the most high-standing moral motive, but it is a motive in behaving or having a sustainable small company. But you also can be passionate on being green, on behaving green, and therefore you do. So the motives, individual motives of starting up companies are quite different. And there are many, many types of that characterized in the literature. Is it very useful to do that? Yeah. I think it is useful to research why people do. Is that because it has become a norm, like driven by communities of Fridays of Future, that behaving sustainable is a kind of norm I have to fulfill. So it is not intrinsically motivated, it is somehow extrinsically motivated because all people around me are a bit green, so I have to be also a bit green and follow some norms. Or is it somehow intrinsically motivated coming out of you? You realize I have to and I really want to. Maybe you feel better doing that, or you think that's societal demand doing that and I really have to do that. So the individual motives of doing that also for companies are quite different in this game. When we go back, the first green startups, what you would label green startups, are in agriculture in the late 19th century. And surprisingly, the first really green startups were coming from religious movements in Germany, also in the United States. You had the first habitats in the United States, and you had a lot of religious people actually preserving nature as their task and as their passion. And you had the same in Germany. You had also some green startups during the fascist time in the 30s in Germany. Dementer is one of the startups in the 30s that was more or less founded by fascists, green fascists at this time. So it has not always the story you want to hear about green entrepreneurship. But many years, not much happened. There were no discussion, environment, social questions weren't really a topic. I mean, we had 2 world wars, first and second. So, and after the Second World War, we had actually increasing social wealth in Europe, United States, almost in all countries. So there was no pressure from people, from society on being more sustainable. I mean, the nature was more or less okay, so there were not many complaints. You had green movements in the 60s and in the 70s. And in the 70s, you also had the first release of a report, the Club of Rome report in 72, which actually reported we are going massively in the wrong direction. And among scientists, among some politicians, it was discussed, but it was all. It didn't have much impact. The first impact actually appears just in the 80s, as we had this ozone layer. And we had a problem because the sun radiation was breaking through, and these people got skin cancer in Australia and in Europe and Northern America. It's long ago, you weren't actually born by that, most of you. But that really was a concern, and the global countries, the society had to react, and they reacted. They prohibited some substances, and the ozone layer was reduced. But it didn't really stop the environmental damage our industry and our economic behavior did to the global environment. And that first was actually addressed much later in Rio and Kyoto. I mean, probably you know the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the milestones in gathering together as countries and coming up with some decisions. But as you know, these decisions are still very vague and more pledges that are not fulfilled in the end. At the same age, 70s, 80s, 90s, you had some green businesses coming up. Cosmetics, tourism industry going really into nature, some food things come up, and that is actually still growing. massively growing, this green businesses. You had also some green institutions coming up, labeling green products. In Germany, Demeter or Alnatura, and all these labels came up. Some of them are really promising. Other labels, do not say much about it. But that all developed in the last 30 years. It's not old. It's actually all a quite new development compared to the long period of neglecting this problem. It's rather new to us that it comes up and that it is growing. And in this way, we also try to define social entrepreneurship or sustainable entrepreneurship. And there it is still a conflict or a debate among scientists what it actually comprises. Does it necessarily have an economic aspect? These two definitions clearly refer to a profit-driven enterprise being sustainable at the same time. You might ask, is it possible? And how much is actually sustainable entrepreneurship? Can anyone claim to be sustainable by being not sustainable? There are many examples that companies claim that, and in reality they are not. Do we have to change the entire business world? That all questions come up when we speak about sustainable entrepreneurship. Is it possible actually to be profit-driven and at the same time sustainable? Using resources, when you make profits, you have to use resources. Labor, material resources, space, air. For everything we do as humans, we have to use resources and making profits out of it. It's also a more philosophical question, but also it's a physical question. Is it actually possible to go on like that? I leave that out. Here would come a small movie on entrepreneurship action in Africa. But you have many examples nowadays, and you might mention many, many more examples of startups that are somehow green, that stayed green a while and then are changed. So they have many, many developments, and you have startups that claim to be green and that are not green. It's always a matter of definition, and that makes it incredibly difficult. I give you one example. We have now a startup in robotics, Conbotics, that's very successful on a market, and it constructs robots the robots can take over work on construction site. They can paint and make easy work there. What they do is they replace labor by doing so. So actually people who have worked formerly on the construction site are replaced by robots. It makes it for a company somehow more plannable because robots can work more than 8 hours. Robots are not sick, at least not for long. You repair them and then they work again. So it has, from a company point of view, a quite sustainable footprint when you do that. From a social point of view, it's probably for most countries not good using these robots because we need this employment and the people need a job and need an income. So you have often very contradicting issues in one business model. And that makes it so difficult to look at it. I remember one discussion that was an event we wanted to organize, and two companies volunteered to subsidize that, to give us money for that. One was Volkswagen, one was Airbnb. So the one produces cars that are unsustainable, but has very well working conditions for the employees. The other one has more disruptive business model, is maybe more sustainable on an environmental side, but has a very bad social footprint on a living in towns. So both are somehow sustainable on one side, but on the other hand side, they're extremely unsustainable. To explain you how difficult it is to capture sustainability in one enterprise. So can you actually measure that? That's the next problem. How do you measure sustainability from startups or from companies? We tried in many articles, in many studies we tried that. But you cannot measure sustainability by turnover or by number of employees or by any profit or by any financial means or numbers, because that's the financial, the economic side. Sustainability you have to measure in other ways. So we came up with variables like how many people are addressed by what you're doing. That defines your social footprint. Is it adaptable? Can you have the business model in one country and can it adapt it to another country? Can you expand that business model? I admit that we're not the best measurements, but we're the ones that could be measured to capture somehow sustainable footprint. The other is, what is actually a sustainable enterprise? Is it a full profit-driven enterprise, which just has a vision with a social or environmental goal, like Google? Google has a clear social goal. Google wants to provide internet to all people on the world. That's purely social. It's their main vision. So Google is an extreme social entrepreneur, if you take it like that. Or does a sustainable enterprise is not allowed making profits? Then we might end up at the other end of the scale in charities. So you are not allowed earning money. You depend on that people giving you money. There are also a lot of charities doing very good things, but it's a complete other business model. And that's also a question you have to ask yourself. I mean, entrepreneurship is extremely broad. Entrepreneurship covers charities, associations, up to full profit enterprises. You can start all in your life. And you can manage all, and all of these different legal structures are difficult to manage. But what actually defines a social or sustainable enterprise? Coming back to the measures of sustainability. After years of research, after 5, 6, 7 years of research, we came now up with a measurement model, and that's labeled sustainable return on investment. And it has to fulfill certain things, because when you start up an enterprise, a startup, you don't have real financial numbers. So we don't have really things that can be quantified. It should be easy. So when I go into the company, it should not cost much time to gather all the data necessary to determine the footprint. I have to be able to quantify that, because whoever is asking wants to have a number. If a politician is asking or an investor is asking, I have to say the footprint is 8 or 10 or 20. I need to quantify what I measure. I cannot tell a long story, and that's one precondition for having really a measurement on sustainable return on investment. And we based it on something which is called lean entrepreneurship, and lean entrepreneurship is something that's not so old, it's 10 years old, and it replaces existing processes of starting up an enterprise in the way that it works a bit as science works. You work with hypotheses. You start out, set your hypothesis, maybe create your prototype and test. And then you reject your hypothesis. You might also improve your hypothesis and test again. It goes in a circular way, and it is more or less a trial and error method before business model, product, process, whatever you do as startup is working. And in this process, you are able to also set and test hypotheses addressing sustainability outcomes. In this way, sustainability gets in a process of being part of the business model. And that's what we are doing actually to teach, to learn, to incubate startups nowadays. It looks pretty complicated, but it is actually pretty easy, and you can measure it. And it should also be measured from external sources, not only from the companies itself, but it is doable. And in this process, by building it in actually creating a startup, you can be more sustainable. As I said, it is very difficult to define what's completely sustainable. It doesn't exist. But you can get more and more sustainable as startup in the incubation, in a business modeling phase. Sustainability. It's always a bit difficult to define, and that's what I was raising already. It's probably easier, as studies show, when you're digital as when you're in chemistry or energy sector. And that also makes it for startups more difficult. You have to be much more authentic in much more selling your sustainable footprint when you are starting in an industry which is supposed to be dirty. You have it easier as IT startup. As our research has shown here in Berlin. When you take sustainable development goals, you can divide them, of course, into economic, environmental, and social ones. And as starting with the games in the beginning, there is an incentive, more or less, to be unsustainable. And digital startups have an even greater incentive to be unsustainable because they are not supposed to be unsustainable. Startups in many, many branches are supposed to be more sustainable. And that you see in the governmental funding of startups. You see it at press releases worshipping unicorns, which probably entirely in Germany are unsustainable enterprises. That all makes you actually behaving as a rational actor being unsustainable, and even more when you're digital. And we made actually a study among more than 5,000 enterprises in Berlin, startups, and it really turns out that IT startups are in their business modeling much more unsustainable than other startups. That the number with the stars is always important because that shows the statistical significance. And that shows that you have a much higher proportion of IT startups following purely economic goals than others, and a much lower proportion of IT startups following environmental or social goals. And is it so surprising? I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley and all the big players in IT, none of them seems to be really sustainable. All of them are real profit-driven enterprises. But that's also part of the discussion, as I said. I mean, you also could define Google as a social enterprise because they have a social vision, even if they make profits. So that's the difficulty in all the discussions about it. Here we have done the same, not IT, but artificial intelligence enterprises. It's around the same. The effects are not as strong, but also there you have a higher proportion following purely economic goals and not environmental and social goals. In another study, we also looked at what actually makes is a personality of entrepreneurs. As you have very different literature about it. In the United States, it's always the literature speaks about the champion. There is a big guy, and the guy starts a company, and the company is successful. In Europe, it's not the champion, it's a promoter. So, but you meet many, so it's more a theme frame. So that when you are successful as enterprise, it's not one person. You need several persons doing that. You need someone selling it, but you also need some great mind behind it, actually doing the products, and some people organizing that. So we have the German literature of the promoters. But the entire literature is about what actually characterizes entrepreneurs, also green entrepreneurs, and that's extrovert characteristics. And we made one study in other regions of this world, also looking at sustainable entrepreneurship. which shows another picture that particularly in Africa and sub-Saharan region, I'm going through here, it's also a regression table. We work a lot with that, with these numbers. But then you see actually conscientiousness is the most important variable as being a successful, sustainable entrepreneur in Africa. And that means actually realizing what's going around you, having really consciously thought about what you are doing. That's much more important being successful than extrovert or being an extrovert person in Africa. And also there are differences when you consider sustainable entrepreneurship, that societies, cultures are differently and ask for request different characteristics of entrepreneurs. I will stop it here. You see that's a complex issue. And we will go into sustainable entrepreneurship from very different angles throughout a series of lectures here.